we have a shortish session on dominant narratives in the Indian media, looking at some of our findings from this review of media, as well as conversations with journalists on how people in the media are talking about climate change and migration. So presenting this are my two colleagues, Nihal Ranjit, who's a researcher at IIHS and works on climate risk communication and urban resilience. Nihal also anchors some of our work on coastal disasters, relocation and recovery. And as I said earlier, he's also the author of this lovely graphic novel called Afterwards. Sophie is a researcher at IIHS and focuses on media communication and storytelling. Currently in the CLAPs project, Sophie is conducting these deep oral histories of Tamil migrants in Kochi and trying to understand how they deal with risk, but also have stories of resilience. So over to both of you. Just before you start, I also want to remind people that there are these questions on the boards on chart papers. Feel free to think about them and put down answers if you want to. I think people aren't putting answers because there are no post-its on the tables. So if someone can just leave post-its around, that'll be helpful. And just throughout the day, you can put in some thoughts. All right, over to both of you. At the end of the presentation, we will open for question and answer. And just to say that this bit actually draws on this, which everyone has in their bags. So yeah, over to you.
Hi, afternoon, everybody. I'm Nihal. I'll just quickly walk you over what we did as part of this media review. And I'll keep it short because we are already running short of time. And so I'll skip some of the introductions as to laying out some context as to why we have done this whole media review exercise. So mostly it was also our way of understanding what are the different discourses that are out there when you talk about climate change migration. And broadly, what we were seeing was that there were the discourses around climate change and migration were broadly on, like, say, how that is portrayed as a form of positive adaptation response, something as a failure to adapt, and so on. And drawing from these, migrants are also portrayed in a similar way, often as victims who are very helpless, as somebody who we have to be scared of. These are probably the larger discourses that are out there when it comes to climate change migration and also about migrants. So, and a lot of different actors kind of contribute to this shaping of these discourses, and media being one of them, like researchers, policymakers, and a whole bunch of other actors help shape this narrative on climate change migration and climate migrants in some senses. And we picked media as one of the actors who shape this discourse to look at what's being said in this sphere. A bit of background on this research. Mostly when we talk about climate change literature on climate migration, mostly when we talk about climate change migration, it's largely focused on international migration, and much of the focus has also been on several of these small island development states, and not so much focus on internal migration, and also in the South Asian context. So that was one of the rationale behind this. And also, when we look at similarly studies on media coverage on climate migration, has also largely been focused on international migration and so on. And even less studies being done in India on internal migration. And so that was kind of the objective of why we wanted to do this. And the main aim was to understand how media represents climate related migration, how they talk about migrants, how they, in terms of what are the reasons for people moving, what are the outcomes of such movements, and so on. And also broadly getting a sense of what are the overall frames that media articles utilize when talking about these topics. So for that, what we did was we did like a quick keyword search using these terms. It was this currently, I mean, we've done this in regional languages also, but I'll be presenting mostly on the English bit. So we've restricted it to English language. This was the period that we did the search on from 2000 to 2023, and that gave us around 141 articles. And then we had like an inclusion exclusion criteria. So we wanted articles that focused only on internal migration, had to be based in India, and should be looking at both, should have reported on internal migration and climate change, not just one of them. And there were like specification on, like, we didn't want like really short snippets that often you see on sidelines of newspapers to come in, uh, and also the type of movement that they were discussing. So particular to disaster displacement, migration of all forms, but not on, like, say, pastoralism, nomadism, shifting culture, and so on. So based on this initial set of review and going over our inclusion exclusion criteria, we that down to like around 76 articles, and this is what we've largely looked at to understand who is depicted as migrating in these. What do media articles talk about? Who's migrating? How is the whole climate change and migration being framed? What sort of evidence body do these articles draw on? And what are the outcomes of such movements that are being discussed? So parallel to this, another exercise that we did was also to speak to a couple of senior journalists and editors who report commission stories on these topics. So I'll quickly, so a larger write-up of this is there in the publication or in one of the sections. So I'll just take like some key points from that and talk about that here. So when it comes to first, what articles, how they depict climate migrants are. So what we predominantly saw was that there is like a homogenization of who these migrants are. So there's very limited information, or they're not differentiated so much in terms of uh, what caste background, what class background, what age, gender. All of these details are kind of missing from the way that articles speak about climate migrants. And in places where they uh, talk about this, it's mostly like you see the differences. So 48 percent of the articles talk about men. Some do talk about like men and women migrating. Some also talk about families migrating, but very, like in the earlier sessions, somebody was talking about how gender is often like a lot of media articles are often gender blind, particularly when it comes to women migrants and so on. So that was also kind of seen in our review, where only 8% of the articles spoke explicitly about women articles, and that roughly narrowed down to like around 3 articles. So, and of those 3, the 2 of those articles largely focused on uh, trafficking, like vulnerability of women to being trafficked as a result of climate change, and one was like a Women's Day special article that had come up. So largely you see like a very, like the women as migrant workers is something that's largely absent in the overall narrative here. Going back to where some of these stories are coming from, what we are seeing is also like there's a lot of focus on the eastern part of our country, mostly states of Odisha. Can I see one? Odisha and West Bengal, and it also correlates with the kind of hazards that we see. So these 2 states are known to be very climatic hotspots and are frequently hit by cyclones, floods, and so on. And naturally, that's also the kind of hazards that kind of get a lot of gets highlighted in a lot of these articles, where more rapid onset events are given a lot more focus. And similarly, like there are far fewer stories from migration from the hills, from other more drought. Sorry, I don't know what happened to my voice. Odisha, from the more interior central parts of our country. And yeah, and this, like I was saying, also correlates with the kind of hazards that media articles usually speak about. So In all of these articles that we saw a high mention of floods and cyclones, slow onset events like heat waves, coastal erosion, etc., had far fewer mention in these articles. When it comes to the reasons for migration, yes, climate change was outlined as a primary driver of migration, and that's also to do with the kind of search we did. We explicitly searched for articles that had climate change and migration in their keywords. So so it's natural to have like a high number of articles that focus or mention climate change as a primary driver. In within our database also there were like around 22% of those articles which had like a very nuanced way of telling the story, where they not just painted like arbitrarily painted climate change as a driver of migration, but tend to like nuance it by painting the whole gamut of challenges that are there, and where climate was presented as being central to all of this, but among the other factors. And then there were articles that were largely more migration driven stories, which had questions of people moving for economic reasons and so on, where climate was often mentioned as a in passing as one of a comma separated issue that kind of pushed people to migrate. Coming to the kind, no, it's okay. Coming to the labels that were like the kind of words that were used to describe uh, migrants, we see a whole bunch of words being used: climate migrants, climate refugees, migrant workers, people who have been displaced, resettled, victims, and so on. And these were largely based and like kind of classification that we were able to discern out of this was like based on the kind of movement that they were reporting on. People, migrants were either depicted as climate migrants or climate refugees, the kind of agency that they had over their mobility decisions. So they were the words used then would be like displaced, resettled, victims, and so on. Interestingly, like some words that did come up was when talking about migrants who had to relocate or who had to migrate as a result of droughts. We saw words like drought migrants being used. Energy migrants was something else that came up in one of the articles, where, if I remember correctly, it's because of shutting down of certain coal mines somewhere, which resulted in a lot of people moving in search of work. So a whole bunch of terminal, and in some articles we even saw like seven of these words being used in the same article, often interchangeably too. uh, like how migrants are discussed, the nature of the movement that is being discussed is also uh, was also quite in a homogeneous or in a generic fashion. And after this, they tend to homogenize the kind of movement, not really nuancing whether it was temporary migration, seasonal migration, or whether people have permanently relocated and so on. Uh, what was absent, and that's also like the case with academic research on climate mobility, is the absence or the limited focus on people who stay behind in these very high mobile zones in the country. And that as part of the CLAPS project, in one of the work packages, is that's what we are focusing on, to understand what are the experience of people who stay behind in some of these places which see a lot of high out migration. As one would expect, that's as in the case of academia, the same sort of limited focuses was also reflected when it came to media articles, where there was far less focus on people staying behind. So and often when they do, they mention that women, children, elderly are all oh God, staying behind. And only one article kind of discussed voluntary immobility, where people are kind of choosing to stay back. So going, Now I'll find it harder to talk. uh, yeah, so like going over this, what largely came across as how media articles are portraying this themes of climate change and migration is it's predominantly framed as a story of crisis. And why, I mean, not to say that that's necessarily a bad thing. Like, one, it's necessary to highlight the impacts on people's lives, livelihoods, and so on as a result of climate change. But when it becomes only that, then it tends to come across as some or the way the migrants themselves are being portrayed comes across as them being always being shown as helpless victims, and so on. And that also there's another risk that arises from this, which is it kind of externalizes the whole climate change issue, where where it seems something that is that cannot be adapted to, that is insurmountable. For instance, this was something that was there even when you talk about disasters and climate change. For the longest time, climate change and disasters in particular, even today in a lot of our policies and acts, it's the word that's often used to describe them are acts of God, right? So it kind of takes the onus, accountability away from power structures, away from people, making it seem like something that you can't really do something about. So increasing or like a increased focus on what are the impacts and the helplessness kind of portrays or gives a similar connotation to the whole thing as something that we can't do anything about. In the earlier session, one of the questions that was posed to Chandni was whether climate change can be seen as a form of adaptation. So very few articles kind of showed that potential, showed that potential of migration where, no, it's fine. I just don't know what happened to my voice. Uh, yeah, where they were shown mostly as what climate change can do, what migration can do when it comes to uh, reducing risk, diversifying incomes, or not. Yeah, in that sense. So what I'm trying to say is largely the focus has been on people uh, leaving and not so much on how that movement helps them adapt. And this would also have some sort of policy ramifications wherein a lot of the policy and interventions that are being shaped tend to largely focus on providing this providing relief for people or trying to control this stop this sort of out migration, and not so much on facilitating this kind of movement. And I'm sure like when Binoy and Libby come tomorrow in the morning session, they can talk about more actions that facilitate movement between source and destination, what they've been working on. And a lot of that also focuses on um some of these biases when it comes to reporting on climate migration, because the focus has largely been on what's happening, what pushes people out, and the moving bit, which is largely rural focus. So very few stories tend to look at what happens to people once they migrate. What's the second, more crucial second half of the story? Because we know that impacts of climate change don't just happen or stop when people move, they kind of follow people. And most often people who move and migrate, they also tend to occupy one of the some some of the most vulnerable, precarious spaces in urban areas, and they are increasingly uh, mm, put at risk even in the urban areas. So the second half of the story is largely missing from the database that we looked at. There were like a few articles that tend to look at what happens to people once they move, the kind of sectors that they work on, and so on. Uh, Coming to some of, and this also flows to the next point, coming to some of the question about framing and the kind of headlines that were used. Actually, there's much far fewer instances of this in Indian media when in comparison to international media. Uh, where there tends to be a form of sensationalism, alarmist sort of framing on this whole idea. So, particularly in the international space, there is a lot of uh, uh, pressure. There's a lot of like focus on these big numbers, the big numbers now, how many people are moving from the global south to global north, and so on. Far fewer when it comes to Indian media, and usually they tend to they come out around the time certain big reports by by World Bank or some UN organizations when they put out, and they largely draw on some of these reports, but then not going into the methodological nuances of those reports and not basing it into what the ground realities are, tend to frame some of these as like you really have no context when you paint these big numbers of millions of people moving and so on. And that also, like what we were discussing earlier, that also kind of negates like glosses over the more multi-causal nuanced ways that results in movement of migration. And then in a lot of these several of these articles, we also find certain like words that have been used which kind of are borderline, one would say, dehumanizing words, like when you describe people's movement as swarms of people moving, floods of people moving, and so on. And again, it kind of paints the picture that this is something that is going to be overwhelm all our systems, that's going to overwhelm the city and so on. That's something that has to be controlled and stopped at all costs. And what that would result in is a framing of public discourse more more so much more from an alarmist and shaped more by alarm, and not so much of from empathy and understanding of what the actual reasons are that pushes people to move. And yeah, some of this also kind draws back onto the kind of evidence base that media articles draw on. So vast majority of the articles that we reviewed did draw on published research articles and reports on these things. So again, like the point that I was saying, with numbers are important, but without rooting them in context, without getting into the methodological nuances of some of these studies, it can seem very abstract in some senses. So an ideal mix would be use some of this data with some human interest stories. Only focusing on human interest stories also has the risk of uh, making everything seem, making portraying people as uh, helpless and as only portraying them as victims. So unless you balance a human interest story where you kind of show the impacts as well, impacts on people, and not and try to avoid people being portrayed as victims, but also as uh, capable agents, that I would say would be like a healthy mix of portraying some of these stories. And in a lot of cases, uh, articles on articles on people who are being pushed to migrate or are choosing to migrate as a result of climate impacts, very few had like quotations or like snippets from conversations with them, and largely they tend to quote experts, policymakers, NGOs, and so on. So yeah, so it also gives off the impression that you I mean, there should be like a balance where you look at both external voices and also like people whose lived experience themselves, lived experience also matter. And I think Sophie would speak about the second part, about what speaking to journalists.
Thank you, Nihal.
Yeah.
While we were looking at what is being published, we also wanted to find out what journalists or how journalists approached covering climate change and migration, like what is really going on in newsrooms or what is going on in the mind of independent journalists, like who are traveling to a lot of these places and reporting on migration, climate change, and other environmental issues, and how they decide what stories to cover and what stories to tell, and like who to quote and which policy to refer to, how are these decisions being taken, and why are certain stories not being told. So this is what we wanted to find out. And we also realized that newsrooms and journalists work under a lot of pressure. Like, one is organizational policies, editorial pressures and priorities, budget cuts, especially after COVID 19, and shifting audience, how audience consume news. So given all of these challenges, we wanted to find out what their approaches were, their challenges, and where they felt things needed to change. Okay, so we spoke to 12 senior editors and journalists across the board, which included legacy organizations, independent media, and digital publications. And what they told us was that climate change is more visible in newsrooms. Like, I left an active newsroom 5 years ago, and I don't remember climate change being one of the major topics being discussed and how we plan the daily coverage or what stories to focus on. But something has shifted over the years, and because all of us are feeling the impacts of climate change, it is a priority now. A lot of newsrooms do focus on climate change as a beat. But what is missing is the link between climate change and migration. Migration is still covered in isolation, but somehow, newsrooms or publications are not being able to make that link between migration and health in the context of climate change, or labor and migration in the context of climate change, or farm crisis or other crises. All these links between how climate change is one of the drivers of these crises, and that is pushing people to move. And one thing that came again and again in these conversations was, what is being reported really depends on what is visible. Like floods, cyclones, disasters like landslides and everything. These are visible to everybody, and that gets a lot of attention. One example that I would like to talk about is the Wayanad landslide last year. Jagdish also spoke about it earlier in the panel. Last year, there was a lot of sustained coverage once the landslide happened, and villages were washed away and people were killed. But after a couple of weeks, the coverage slowly started dipping, and we weren't reading anything or much about the landslides. But in the last 2 weeks, if you've noticed, because it was the 1-year anniversary of the disaster, then I think there were some recall articles, and some people again traveled to Wayanad to see what was happening. But again, in the next 2 weeks, that's going to trickle down as well. But what we don't know is what happened to the people. Where did they go? How did they build back? So that kind of focus, I think, is missing from media narratives, which editors have also acknowledged, because the priorities keep changing for a publication. This is not the only thing that a publication focuses on. So then naturally this sort of interest then tends to slow down. And still, there are harmful stereotypes that still exist, and journalists also acknowledge that media plays a huge part in propagating or strengthening those stereotypes. One example would be, even in our own field work, what we realize in Kochi is also there's a mix of Tamil migrants, Bengali migrant workers, and Odia migrant workers who are working in different parts of Kerala. There is visibly a narrative that is perpetuated to alienate them in most of the discourses. Like, one is through language, where they are called bais and bayas, and that sort of seeps into some of the media narratives as well. And one crime from a migrant worker sort of gets amplified through media narratives. and then the entire community gets blacklisted. So I think this is also something that publications are actively trying to counter and be more empathetic and understanding towards how we portray migrant workers. And what is missing from the narratives are it's mostly a crisis narrative, right? So when somebody moves, when there is a mass migration, and one turning point was the COVID-19, where I think reporting was much more empathetic and understanding of what the migrants were going through during COVID-19, and some of these visuals were really powerful in getting governments and other actors just step in and help them get to their destinations. But otherwise, it's all looked at in isolation. Like, for example, every 3 months or 6 months, we see articles that say 200 or 300 workers from this state have died in this state. So they are reduced to numbers. But we don't know who these 200 workers are. What is their story? I mean, they do understand, and we also do understand that it is not possible to write about all the 300 workers, but just to humanize these stories, to say, like, and not just reduce them to a mere statistic, and follow their journey. Where did they come from? What were they doing here? This is important because then that sort of links to occupational safety, their living conditions, and climate impacts in where they live and where they work. Like in Kerala, a lot of people die in factories of heat and other occupational hazards. So these sort of stories and the narratives don't come out because we tend to, or the media tends to, just amplify or repeat what data is given to them, the daily coverage. There isn't sustained coverage as such. And then there is limited representation of what happens to migrants once they move from their source areas. And there's one, there are exceptions though. One story I would like to recall is the Scroll story, which it's a long form article which tracked migrants' journey from Odisha to Kerala. I think the headline is From Odisha to Kerala, a bus of migrants. So, which also talked about then what prompted these people to move and what are the challenges that they face in the destination areas. What are they going to do? And it also very nicely showed the resilience of these migrant workers in taking these decisions and give them that agency that, migration is also one way that they try and cope. It's a survival strategy, it's an adaptation strategy. They're just trying to move to another place to make their lives better or to educate their children and build back in, or like send back money and build their homes or improve their lives and living conditions. So that focus is somewhat missing, which newsrooms are also trying to change, and there's a lot more sustained coverage. And the other one is voices of migrant workers themselves. So there are serious limitations also here because language is always a barrier, right? So people may not be familiar with the language that migrants speak. And Kavita rightly pointed out that the language that we know is not useful to the migrants. So what we report about them may not be useful, like they don't know what we are writing about them. So that's a serious challenge. And mostly stories about migration depend a lot on these data sets and research findings, and then try to sensationalize certain narratives. Yeah, this is really this was really useful for us to understand where things need to change, because reliable data is a problem. One, we haven't had a census since 2011, and nobody is telling, there is no official data that says that this person moved from point A to point B because of climate change, or the agriculture crisis in their village is due to climate change. So this is a serious challenge which I think all of us are trying to grapple with. And it is always difficult to establish climate as a cause. So then they are having to rely on anecdotes from communities and local organizations, community organizations, and local government, and etc., and which is not always fruitful, because somebody did mention that there's a lot of policy gaps in terms of how much knowledge bureaucracy holds, or the local governments hold. So then this is a serious challenge that journalists are also working with. And then this pressure for fast attention grabbing stories. So the landscape of journalism has changed so much in the last many years, at least in the last 10 years, where real stories that are impacting every one of us don't get much attention, and newsrooms and independent publishers are also struggling to break this pattern. And this is a challenge that mostly freelance journalists face, because almost all of the time they will have to spend out of their pockets, because talking about migration takes time. It's not a desk job. So they need to travel to source and destinations, meet people, listen to these stories, and analyze data, and all of this takes time. And most of the times the time is a time, cost, and data, I think, if I were to put it that way, is something the journalists are struggling to pull everything together and make sure that all of this is there. And there isn't enough funding or enough time and budget dedicated to climate change and migration in publications, and lack of access. So one of our editors pointed out that researchers too can sometimes be very closed. Like, they will not part with data or the knowledge, or they may not want to talk to media because they're afraid of being misrepresented. So they don't talk to the media and share findings from whatever they are working on. So these are the limitations that journalists, I can see Nevin nodding. So what good reporting looks like, there are many examples that the editor shared with us. Some of them have been included in the guide. I think good reporting is one where stories track the full journey, where you're looking at one person's journey from the source to the destination, including all the challenges and wins and losses, etc. And it is a mix of data and lived experiences, like Nihal mentioned, and also includes expert and policy voices, and avoids blame or pity. Like, sometimes stories focus on the human aspect of it, but they're just reduced to just helpless victims of what they don't have, instead of looking at how they are trying to find their own agency and strength in a place that they don't know anything about. And uses respectful terms to refer to migrant workers. But the majority of the publications have moved away from stereotyping and are using words like migrant workers or just workers, and give them the dignity of labor. So that's a positive change that is happening. And I think, because migration and climate change is not a one-time story, and it needs to be written about again and again, and these places have to be revisited over and over. Journalists also said that all the communities need to come together. Researchers have data and context. Media publications have storytelling skills and platforms. So then all of these need to come together to tell better stories, change the narratives around these issues. and also find ways to fund these stories, like find budgets and newsroom allocations, and probably have climate change and migration across the beats and not as an isolated uh, coverage or a topic to be covered, and figure out ways to make local expertise and data easier to access, and also look at how migration is talked about as an adaptation strategy and not necessarily as a crisis or a tragedy that is unfolding because of which people are moving. And this is very important, support regional language reporting, because like Kavita pointed out, sometimes English stories, however detailed and long and rich they are, it doesn't reach the people that who needs to read the story. For example, a town panchayat leader, that story may not, he may be in a position to act, but that story may not be the right way to reach him. So these are the gaps then all of us have to come together to fill. And we would like to leave you with this question, something for all of us to think about, and that's not just for the media people, it's for everybody in this room. Thank you very much.
Yes, we can take a few questions or any thoughts. It's in some ways talking back to an audience that these questions were asked to. So there's some of this resonate with you. Just maybe a few questions, if at all.
I can share a couple of lived experiences while dealing with journalists.
I would just suggest one thing. Yeah. Also, let's keep it short so that more people can contribute. So
Yes.
but that's
Yeah, so just my experience of, interacting with journalists, because Pradhan is, if there is, I mean, there are other organizations definitely in India. I'm not saying that we are the only one, no point in saying that, but having reached out to millions of grassroots families, Pradhan has, a mine of information and stories regarding anything that pertains to climate, gender, migration, so on and so forth. And we have tried many a times to reach out to journalists to do this end-to-end story. And this problem of, arranging budget for that, to help them to reach out to these areas has been the biggest pain point, both for us and them. Why I say us, there is no dearth of money as far as documentation and communication is concerned in our organization at present. Touch wood. But we are not supposed to fund media or journalists to cover the stories, because that very act will be interpreted as influencing the national narrative. So we are not supposed to, organizations like us, we are not supposed to fund the journalists, even arranging, the travel, indirectly also. So if some kind of investigation happens, then it will be caught. So therefore, that is a problem we face. So as you rightly mentioned, that funding has to be arranged. So the onus, where does the onus lie, and how to grapple with that problem? Thanks.
Thanks, Mr. Chatterjee. That was really helpful to hear from you, because we are on the other side of it. And it is a big struggle finding funding. Now, I just wanted to point out to one thing in the beginning. On the one of the first slides says that we are not looking at stories on pastoralism. I just wanted to say that pastoralism also has migration in it. And while it's traditionally viewed as, set roots, but because of climate change, pastoralism roots have also changed. And on Pari, we have many stories which are showing from Ladakh to Rajasthan to Gujarat to South India, how because commons have been closed off, because grazing grounds are no longer have grass on them, that pastoralists are also having to change their routes. And so I think that those are also stories of climate change. Yeah.
Some of those stories came up in our Kannada.
Okay.
Can I ask, please talk about funding for travel? Because PARI is one of the few organizations, media organizations that pay journalists to travel. Not pay them to write, but pay them also to travel. So if you can
Yes. Kavita, putting me in a spot now. Okay, so yes, we do have a budget for travel, but I say this with all honesty, is that we cannot travel, we cannot fund very high-end travel. I myself have taken state buses to travel while reporting, and that's something that we so when it's so we try and also make sure that it's not like, we are not like National Geographic, we don't have that kind of funding. So yes, we are happy to fund, but please do keep your budgets low, so that it's not that kind of dollar funding that we have. So we are happy to fund if the travel budget is reasonable, and over and above that we also pay, and if the story has a video element, then it gets paid a little bit more.
It's
One
not
of the
easy.
things we try and tell journalists who are going out into the field to overcome what you're talking about, for example, if you're getting funded for a story on X, then and you are in the field, then try and do a story on ABCD as well. So that is training of mine for being a journalist for over 30 years, is that we were never sent into the field to do one story. It was too expensive even then. You always expected to do more than one. So that's also one of the things we try and spread out.
So just responding to what you said, Soporno. So another thing is, even when NGOs fund media travel, we also want to maintain editorial independence, right? So what happens is, usually when an NGO or an organization funds our travel, there's always that last line which is like, okay, story kya ho raha hai, and what are you going to do in that story? Please don't say bad things about us. So that's so we've, in fact, a lot of us actually have taken a step back and actually not go whenever there's somebody saying, oh, we'll fund your travel, you come and see what we've been doing. So we are also very careful, and that's one of the reasons, I think, why there are these curbs on NGOs not being able to work with the media, because in a way you do sort of influence. I mean, not you, but in general, there is an influence also when you bring in, and there's an expectation of what are you going to write. And trust me, we've been harassed by a lot of individuals who've like, okay, you come here, you stay for 2 days, and then we've gone back and it's like, what story you're doing, can you share the draft? And we've said, no, this is an editorial independent piece, so we are not paid. You're not paying us to write the story, right? The payment was that you were facilitating the visit and even the accommodation, or 50, it's a 50-50 deal. So that also hinders a lot of time from us even approaching or even talking on those lines. Can I still
Yeah.
do the story, and still maintain integrity of that piece? And in a way, you spoke about being seen influencing the media. I would say the media is getting influenced by other factors any which
Yeah.
way. So that's another complication there. But we would like to I mean, we would like to have influences which, the voices which still are not really getting heard. Nihal, you mentioned that journalists go to researchers and quote data and trends. I would argue that that's really essential also. I mean, not without the sensationalization part. Some of us are at the desk level for a reason, because we actually get to analyze trends sitting at the desk, and
Yeah.
not all of it can happen going on the ground. In fact, sometimes lived experiences, data
Mismatches.
mismatch a lot. A lot of the times we've seen lived experiences telling us things which are not adding up. This happens a lot when, say, some people are working in a mangrove plantation, and the plantation inevitably has been
Yeah.
funded by somebody. So that person's lived experiences basically voicing what that funder wants them to say.
Yeah.
In that case, my story gets completely skewed.
Yeah.
It is skewed. And but then when I look at the data, I look at the satellite data, do a before after, then I see it's really not matching with the claims. So I
Yeah.
think what we've learned is, even taking these anecdotes, these evidence, all these lived realities, also with a pinch of solved. Not saying that don't be
it's not either
don't listen.
or.
Listen.
Absolutely.
It's not black and white. And there was a very interesting point that we tend to see everything as a tragedy, especially when it comes to migration. But we've seen, especially in terms of seasonal migrants, we've seen this trend where people are wanting to come back. They'll come back, do their farming again, get back, get up,
Go into
pile of money home. And there are stories which are also stories of hope, especially women migrating out, creating businesses, small businesses.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
All right. So thank you. And the Mongape piece that was quoted was actually your piece, which talks about migration as adaptation. It was one of the few articles that we found actually that does that, right? I want to turn my attention to this part of the room, and if there are any questions, maybe we take two and then let's close for lunch. Nevin, we'll come back. We have 2 days still. Yeah.
Not a question, but adding to the discussion. Two quick things. One, yes, private experts are really essential. And a good example of this is because, I mean, yes, not only is the census delayed, but also India does not officially maintain all cause migration data, let alone climate migration data. So you absolutely have to rely on private research for that. And second thing, it's interesting because since morning I heard this several times that a migrants agency over their movement. I'm just thinking out loud, and we can discuss this over the break also. As Sahana said, it's not always a tragedy. So in the newsroom, I am thinking of it as okay, if you don't want to pitch the idea to your editor as a story of tragedy, ki, oh, look, there was this extreme weather event which caused 3,000 people to migrate inland, but some of them were able to build better than what it was about. My question is, will the editorial response be positive? It is something for all of us to think about. Often tragedies, a pitch about a tragedy is picked up, and a pitch about, say, somebody moving inland and building better might not be as, yeah.
It's a mix because sometimes it's also that editors will say, don't give us bleeding heart stories. We don't want tragedies. So maybe depends on, what the overall thinking is of the editorial, board.
Constructive journalism, right? So they want to also inform the policymakers that okay, this is one way to probably support communities who are going to other cities to pick up work, because look, this person has been able to do this because he or they were able to avail of a local scheme in the destination. So maybe that, if you look at it from that approach, that if I am going to write a piece which is showing how they adapted in the destination, then this also sort of informs policy making. I think that's when editors get convinced that okay, this, because now every day everybody talks of impacts, like what impact is your story going to have?
Yeah. And we also have we have also been struggling with this a bit, and we have a section. I know this term of solutions journalism has come, it's just, especially in the climate change space, we see this a lot. So we have given some examples at the back of the guide, but I think it's a deeper conversation as well about the crafting of that.
We had the anchor. The anchor was typically the piece where, slightly positive stories carry space, find space, and that continues.
Last question, I'm sorry, and then let's break for lunch and continue this, because we do have a hard start instead of hard stop at 2:30, because we have an Saffron
Chanti,
joining
I
us.
can ask this tomorrow.
Fine, no, please do ask it. No, let's do it.
No, I'm just talking as someone from the community organization side of the thing. I mean, I'm taking away a sense that there is an inherent assumption in this room that access to journalists and access to storytellers for organizations that are doing work on the ground is easy or easily available. And the fact of the matter is that it's not true. Like Saparno from Pradhan or me from Grambikas or organizations which are, like he says, has no laws of funding for documentation and have frankly staffed by people with privilege and articulation ability and language will, I mean, even look at this room, right? Those of us in the room have access to spaces like this where we can meet a cohort like this and then build that relationship. Much of the work that's happening in because one of the slides said community access, and the stories that you want to tell outside of very organized research is also where you will find, like the fisherwomen, the absence of fisherwomen in the narrative are also where you will find when you go and talk to highly localized smaller size nonprofits who can give you access to community. Now we, Robin and I mean, we are people who are trying to solve for this for the many nonprofits that we work with, and I must tell you that it is extremely difficult. And if we can collectively even start thinking about how to solution for that, even if we mobilize funds, see, funds is a part of the problem, right? It's something to be solved for and something to be figured out. It's an operational issue. But democratizing access to journalists who tell, Pari is one organization who kind of seems to have done a good job of it, and but that's really, even for us, finding who is telling, how are they interested, what is the pitch, even if it's not solutions journalism, right? Even to come and cover, very hard. So how do we kind of then unlock that space, and a lot of the community localized nonprofits are not people who can talk in English. I mean, their leaders don't have time. Even organizations like us, their leaders don't have time to pitch to journalists. So then, I mean, I was talking to Gopi from Monga Bay, and he was telling me that, Priya, you will have to pitch, right? It cannot be someone, now, how much will I pitch? How much of my time will I spend in, then what is that? I mean, how do you unlock that access, right? To diversity of representation of stories is also linked to that. If you come and talk to Pradhan or Grambikas, you will hear the same things over and over again after a period of time, right? So, I mean, it would be great for the field to think through that, right? Otherwise, we are not going to solve the linearity of narrative discourses and things like that. It's not going to happen.
Yes. So, Priya, I completely hear what you're saying. And just to add to that, so I did two stories on one about a migrant labor who was raped and sexually assaulted by her own husband who'd taken her as a migrant. And it was a sexual gender based violence story. And I also did one on a labor helpline, both from Rajasthan, Banswara district, with Ajivika. Now, interestingly, Ajivika never approached me for the story. I found the story and I approached them. And then I said, hey, you guys are involved. You're actually doing migrant work and you're making, helplines and you're making this literature for migrants and so on. And so l- while I hear what you're saying, that, it's difficult for you to approach, I think also journalists are not sometimes looking for those stories or picking up those cues. If it's a sexual violence
It's not to
story.
say one against the other, Preeti. I mean, I'm just saying it's a complex, how do we co-create? I mean, that space where that problem is solved. I fully believe that outreach needs to happen, and it's not possible for individual journalists to, cover the vastness of the space.
No, but
But-
they don't, journalists are not going to rural areas.
Yeah, that's,
That's the big challenge.
yeah.
So, which is what, when Kavita is saying, about funding, this is the real thing, that are people really willing to go to a rural area? And when I went to Banswara, I didn't know where I was going to stay. I don't know how many days I'm going to stay, to cover those two stories. So that is also a challenge that journalists today are not taking, because they're sitting in urban India and writing in English on something happening 500 kilometers away. It's okay. I can just speak to some experts and get it out.
Mm. This is crazy because when we were planning this workshop and doing all this stuff, this is exactly what Sophie and Ketki were telling us, that journalists are no longer going to rural India. This blew my mind because I had not thought that this trend this has happened in media.
And they don't earn enough of journalism. So they are doing multiple jobs. Journalism is just one of them. That we are finding more and more. Yeah.
Or,
Yeah.
yeah. Absolutely. The other thing, actually, no authorship also. The other thing that Sophie and Ketke told me, I had said, okay, are we going to get a crowd? Because this is not a crowd we usually speak to. How are we going to moderate these discussions? Will people speak? And she said, oh, don't worry. The journalists in the room, they are going to talk. There are going to be questions. So don't worry about that. And it's really, yeah, but it's really nice to see this discussion.